All right, to both sides, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for. Is this on? Is this on? No. All right. It was a good try. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Allison Adam Steinmetz, in memory of his grandfather, Rabbi Sheldon Steinmetz, Rav Shlomo Tzvi Ruvain, Ben Livracha, Semyon Esterson, in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Levi, Aaron Cohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Hanach Ephraim, that's Sammy's mother whose yahrzeit is today. And again, Le'ilui Nishmas, Sammy's father who was nifter yesterday and whose levaya is today, Mordechai ben Yona, Zichron Livrach, in the memory of their dear friend, family friend, Staff Sergeant Naftali Yona, Gordon Hashem Yikom Damo, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in memory of Paul's sisters, Leah Bas Shmuel, Zachrini Shulamis Bas Shmuel, and his aunt Esther Bas Zachari. Our Day of Learning sponsors, Ed and Iris Miller, in memory of Dr. Arthur Shapiro, Al Yuna, Ben Yitzchak Elchanan, whose Shloshim is today, our Daf Yomi, and Sarah Steinberg, exclusive continued health for Shulamis Chana Bas Susha, Seth and Rachel Rosenberg, in memory of Esther Sin Zechron Bracha, and Pauline Kathy Pollack, in the schos of Refuah Shlema for Bracha Batya. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all the Neshama of the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah shavan together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, and in merit of Shemach Baruch Hu should shed light and bracha for Am Yisrael in the days ahead. But with that, let us move a lot to do today. Today's daf is Tzadik Gimel 93, and we are picking up on Tzadik Beis on Beis 92b. We left off with Boi Rabbi Avin, which is exactly 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20 lines up from the bottom. So by Rabbi Avin asked the following shayla: Chata sa'of shehechnis dama b'tzavara b'fnim mahu. What is the halacha? It's actually, we began this case yesterday. If you take a chata sa'of into the Beis Hamikdash and the blood is still in its neck. Now, in other words, as I mentioned yesterday, at the close of yesterday's shir, so if you bring a carbon that's supposed to be externally, right, or a carbon achitzon, and you bring it inside, that disqualifies the carbon. Now, that's true if you bring the blood, right? If you bring the meat, if you bring the body of the animal, that doesn't necessarily disqualify. So the shayla over here is, you did malika on the bird, right? And the blood is still in the neck, and you brought the bird into the inside of the Beis Hamikdash like that. Does that disqualify the carbon? Ma'u savra kli sharis tam yomifsal. Do we say that the neck of the bird is like a kli sharis, like a service utensil, and for again, the carbon is going to be fossil? Or no, maybe the neck is like the flesh, and therefore the same way that if you bring the meat of a carbon inside, it doesn't disqualify the carbon, so too if you bring the blood in the neck of the bird, the blood in the neck is considered to be blood in the flesh, and that wouldn't disqualify. So that's the shayla. So Gemara says, Tashma, pirkasa v'nichnas chazak sheres. Well, interesting case. Let's say you shot the bird, and pirkasa means the body moved. What's the right word? I'm sorry? Convulsed. The body convulsed, and as a result of the convulsions, it ended up moving itself inside of the mikdash, and then it came back outside. The carbon is kasher. Interestingly enough, that's a case of involuntary. What can you infer from here? I can infer from that if you intentionally brought the bird into the mikdash, that ultimately that would invalidate the carbon. Or the Tamech, the Gemara says, using that same logic, Gabi Kadshe Kadoshim Diktani Pirkisa V'Yatza Ladaram B'Chazra Kshera. I will say, using that same logic, what about the case by Kadshe Kadoshim? By Kadshe Kadoshim, it says if the convulsed and ultimately moved into the south side of the Azara, because remember, by Kadshe Kadoshim, Shchita's where? B'Tzafon in the north. Let's say the animal went ahead, you shechted the animal, and then ultimately again it went in the south. Then it came back into the north. What's talacha? Kshera. Ultimately, the animal is kosher. Ha siya psula. But we can add that if you intentionally took it to the south, it would be possible. And both saying now we know that that's not true. That's not true. In other words, even if you intentionally took the animal to the south, the carbon is not. Ela hayatzat salachutz itzrichale. Rather, you have to say that the case of yatzat salachutz is the case that we need. Really, the case over here is if you ended up taking the carbon outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Hachanami yatzat salachutz itzrichale. So too over here, by the bird, the case of convulsion, ultimately, again, the case that actually matters to us is the case where the animal convulsed and then went outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Not as much about where the animal goes ahead or the bird goes into the Kodesh, or ultimately the Kachek Adashim goes into the south. That's not the case that concerns us. Okay, so the Gemara leaves the question unanswered. I said the case ultimately again of where you bring the blood of the bird in the neck, while still in the neck, into the Kodesh. Into the Kodesh, into the Heichal. What's the status? Is it like in the flesh? Is it like in the Kli Sharis? The Gemara leaves that question open. All right, boy Rabbi Abin, Nishbach Asva Mahu. What's another interesting case over here? Let's say the sacrificial blood spilled on the floor, and you gathered it back up. This is by a bird offering. Right? By a bird offering, so you spilled it on the floor, then you gathered it back up. Mahu, what is the status of the blood? On one hand, the Gemara says, so maybe again, and remember, what's unique about the blood of a bird, we saw this in yesterday, we saw it long before, but remember again, by a bird, the halacha is there's no kli sharis, right? By a typical carbon, what happens? You shecht the animal, you do kabbalah in a kli sharis, and then you do zrika from that kli sharis. In a bird offering, there's no kli sharis. Rather, you do malika on the bird, and then the blood applications are done directly from the body of the bird itself. So Rabbi says, so now interestingly enough, what happens in this case over here? You go ahead and you shech the bird, the blood spills on the floor. Now obviously what you're doing now is you're collecting the blood into a kli sharis. So the shaila now is, what is the status ultimately again of that blood? Do we say asruche hudalo asruche rachmana kli sharis? Do we say like this? You know what, the Torah didn't require a kli sharis, and therefore again v'hilchach osva v'kasher. So again, it's that the Torah didn't require it. In other words, you don't need a kli sharis, but if you had a kli sharis, ultimately again it's fine. And therefore, when you collect the blood back up and put it into a kli sharis, the blood itself will still be usable. O Dilma, or the other possibility is mifsal pasal beirachmana kli sharis. Maybe the Torah actually disqualifies the use of a kli sharis. The hilchach osva upasal. And halacha l'maisa, in other words, a kli sharis actually disqualifies the blood, and therefore, if you were to go ahead and gather the blood back up in a kli sharis, in fact, the halacha would be it would disqualify the blood. So that's the shaila. So I'll say, so actually, this is very interesting because it's a yesodistic shaila in kli sharis by a bird offering. Do we say that a bird offering doesn't need a kli sharis, but if you have one, fine? Or do we say, no, a bird dafka can't have a kli sharis, and if you have one, it actually disqualifies? So Amar Rava says as follows, Tashma, Yochel Yehidam Achatas Ovton Kibus. You might have thought, well, it's hearkening back to yesterday's daf, that you might have thought that when halacha l'maisa, that when the dam chatas of sprinkles on clothing, you might have thought that requires laundering. Talmud Lomar Zos, we saw this in yesterday's daf. Ultimately, Zos is a limiting factor to say that the din of kibos, the din of laundering, only applies to the blood of animal sacrifices. Now, the Gemara, watch this. Now, if you say that when bird blood comes into a kli sharis, it's automatically disqualified. If that in fact is true, so the Gemara says, Seifokle, if solei ba'avir kli. Then the truth is, when the blood goes ahead and hits the garment, ultimately, again, the blood should be disqualified because why? Because the garment itself is considered to be a kli. Because the garment is considered to be a kli, therefore the blood should be disqualified. In other words, forget about kibos, the blood should just be disqualified. To which the Gemara says, Seifokle, if solei, I'm sorry, so then literally again, when that blood hits the garment, the blood should be disqualified because the garment has the status of a kli. No. So it could very well be that halacha is both sides. So remember that the only time that blood requires kibus was when it was sacrificially fit. If it was sacrificially unfit, then there's no din kibus. Well, if we say that the blood of a bird is disqualified when it comes into a klishares, then the halacha is disqualification in klishares even when you get to the airspace of a klishares. If that's the case, once it gets to the airspace, ultimately again of the garment, ultimately it should be possible. So the Gemara says, what's the case? The case is where there's no airspace, and ultimately again you're applying the blood of the bird directly to the garment itself. Okay, so good. So we'll say that's the next case. Now, interestingly enough, the Gemara doesn't seem to answer this case either. So again, in this type of situation where halacha l'maisa, again, the blood of the bird spilled on the floor, you collected it back up in a klishares, is the blood usable or not? It depends. Do we say that klishares you don't need it, but if you have it by the blood of a bird, fine? Or do we say no, klishares disqualifies by blood of a bird? Once again, open-ended question. Baimine Levi, nitas mi beged lebeged mao. This is an interesting case. Levi has telling kasha. So remember again, we've established in yesterday's daf that if you have sacrificial blood that splatters on a garment, ultimately the garment requires kibus. What happens if the blood splatters from garment 1 to garment 2? What's the status ultimately again of garment 2? So Mahu, so Gemara says, "Mi beged kama itchile lekibus." Oh, Dilma, low. So we'll say the shaila essentially is like this. The shaila is: do we say that once? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi is 6 lines down from the bottom. So obviously this is talking about dam behema. Rashi points out, right? Because remember, bird blood does not generate a kibus obligation. So this is animal blood. So do we say? Look at Rashi. Itchile mi kibus. Rashi says the garale minishbach minakli ala ritzba va'asu va'achar kach nitaz ala beged. The hasam cave in the kash. Here's the shaila essentially. So do we say that halacha l'maisa, once the blood splatters on the first garment, it's essentially unusable. Once it's unusable, then once it splatters onto the second garment, it's meaningless. Because remember again, what we've established is the only time that halacha l'maisa, blood requires kibus, is when it is sacrificially fit blood. But if it is sacrificially unfit, then there is no din of kibus. So again, do we say once it hits the first beged, even if it's invalid. Once it subsequently hits the second beged, then ultimately again there's no kibus obligation. So this is a good kasha. Ta'an Tigmar says, this question, Ta'an kibus imanavshach. The truth is the second beged requires kibus regardless. How so? I osvo v'kasher ha-kasher. So I'll say, so again, the Gemara actually wants to compare this to a case of blood that spills on the floor and then you collect it back up. So if we say that ultimately, again, when you collect it back up, it's kasher lizrika, then the case of where it splatters on the second garment should be no different. The osva upasal, and if you hold that no, when it splatters on the floor and you collect it back up, the blood is pasal. Anak Rabbi Akiva Svirale. He says, I hold like Rabbi Akiva. What does Rabbi Akiva say? The Amar Hay Salo Shas HaKosher V'nif Sala. Rabbi Nabo say we're going to see this sheet in a little bit. Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that as long as sacrificial blood was kosher at some point in time, even if it subsequently became a puzzle, when it splatters on a garment, the garment will require kibos. Rabbi say this stands in contradistinction to our Mishnah, right? The primary opinion in our Mishnah was that in order for blood to generate kibos, ultimately, again, the blood has to be sacrificially fit. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that Allah Chalamai says, as long as it had shas kosher, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, you have to do kibos, right? That's why the Mishnah said, chatas psula ein dama ta'on kibos. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says as follows. So therefore, again, so he says, I hold like Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva says, as long as the blood was fit, even if it is subsequently unfit, ultimately again requires kibos. Top of Tzadikim Abosai 93a. 93a. So therefore, Abosai, interestingly enough, so kind of third question left unresolved. If it splatters from Beged 1 to Beged 2, is there a din of kibos or not? Third question, open-ended. Tzaddikim 93a top. Boy minei. Nitas al beged tamei mahu. Another interesting case. What happens if halacha l'maisa, the blood splatters on a beged that is tamei? This is actually a fascinating question to contemplate. If you take a look at the top Rashi, Rashi says like this. Rashi says, Nitas al beged tamei v'nitba b'nigi asa. Now, we're talking about a case where the blood became tamei upon contact with the garment. Rashi says, Mi have dam pasal, kilu nitma kodem lachein v'lo ba'ikibas. So remember again, we're going with the idea that in order for blood to be required, in order for blood on a garment to, in order for a garment to acquire kibos, the blood itself has to be sacrificially fit. So the shaila now is, when blood falls on a garment which is tamei, does that garment require kibos? Which essentially, what's the kasha? Do we view the blood as being kosher at the time, fit at the time that it hit the garment? Or no, we essentially view it as tamei from the beginning, and therefore again, no din of kibos. So the Gemara says, that's the shaila. Amar Rav Huna, Breit Rav Yoshua, midikami boi lehachi. Since we're asking this particular question, the Gemara says, Shmamina haisa lo shasa kosher v'nifsala ein dama ta'on kibos. We could infer from this, by the way, that halacha l'maisa, if blood was kosher and then became tamei, or then became pasul, that such blood would not require kibos. When is that so? Hani mili b'zeh hazeh. That's only true ultimately, again, if these events occurred in succession. Aval bebasachos, but if they occur simultaneously, lo, that would not be the halacha. Look at Rashi, just a moment. So when do we say that if blood was kosher and then became pasul, that there's no din of kibos? That's when first the blood became pasul and then it splattered. But interestingly enough, when, let's say again, the invalidation of the blood occurred at the same time as the splattering on the garment, that's not so clear, right? Because that's our case. Our case over here is the blood becomes unfit, but the blood becomes unfit mamish at the exact time that it falls on the garment. Oh, dilma loshna, or perhaps there's no distinction. Perhaps Shabbos say at the end of the day, what we look at is like this. When that blood falls on the garment, is the blood sacrificially fit or not? If it is, it's ta'un kibos, right? It requires kibos. If not, it doesn't require kibos. That's our shayla. This question itself ultimately, again, is a machlokes Rav Elazar and the Rabbanon. So we'll say, what's the case over here? The very interesting. Valiba de Rabba, and according to the commentaries, say Abaye. This sign, here we go. This is very interesting. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Mechatas shenitmu. So we'll say this is actually fascinating. If you have mechatas, waters of the para aduma, that became tamei. That became tamei. So the waters themselves that became tamei, mitarin. They still have the ability to go ahead and make a tahar. I will say, do you hear how incredible that is? Look at Rashi. Rashi's in the second short line, mitarin. Es ha'adam mitumas meis ki'ilu lo nitma. So I will say, isn't this incredible? That if waters of the paraduma become tamei, ultimately, again, they have the ability to make a person tahar. And the lashon of Rashi actually is very interesting. Rashi, if you look at right, esa adami tumas meis ki'ilu lo nitma. Right? Isn't that fascinating? That you have to wonder why Rashi puts in that phrase. Right? The waters of the paraduma have a person to have the ability to make a person tahar from tumas meis as if he was never tamei. What does that mean? So I'll say, so there could be also like Rashi could be giving us a profound insight into the power of tshuva as well. You know, a lot of times when we think about tshuva, so we think about tshuva as, okay, I do tshuva, I committed an aveira, I did tshuva. Tshuva has the ability to kind of wipe away some of the negativity, but the scars of the sin remain. It's not true. The power of tshuva is that tshuva has the ability to effect complete purification and exoneration. Tshuva has the ability to wipe your slate clean. Tshuva has the ability to literally give you a fresh start. Just like when you get sprinkled by the waters of the para aduma, it takes away your tumah as if it was never there. It's not the pshat that I'm a tamei person who became tahar. It's as if I was never tamei at all. So to tshuva, I think Rashi is giving us a window into tshuva. Tshuva has that same power as well, to not just cleanse you of sin, but literally again to remove it as if it was never there. So the Gemara says as follows. Now, how do we know that? That if waters of para aduma become tamei still work. Listen to this. Shaharinida mazin aleha. Because Rabbi say we sprinkle paraduma waters upon a woman who is a nida. Now, what does this mean? So, say, now watch this. Let's say Rachel's a nida, right? And she contracts tumas meis. So, what do? We sprinkle the waters of para aduma on her. Now, what happens when the para aduma waters hit a woman who's a nida? What happens? The waters become tamei, because that's what a nida does, right? And therefore, yet we see that the waters still work. So, what do you see from here? That even when the waters of para aduma become tamei, they still have the ability to affect tara. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Shahare nida, third short line. Shenitma b'meis mazin aleha lifnei tevilas nidcha v'tavalas l'shtei atumas b'tevila achos. So it's a really incredible idea. So you could sprinkle para aduma water upon a woman, ultimately again, who is Timeya, right? Because again, in halacha l'maaseh, the waters of the paraduma will still work. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabba. So we'll say, so what does that show you? That shows you that halacha l'maaseh. Oh, good. Amar Rabba, Rabbi Lazar b'shivas Rabbi Akiva Rabba Amra, and Rabbi Lazar holds like Rabbi Akiva his Rabbi. The Amar ha'avaras kli al gabe makom tamei kamunach tamei. Now watch this. So Rabbi Lazar holds like the yeshita of Rabbi Akiva, who holds that when you go ahead and you pass a kli over a tamei area, it is as if that kli has come to rest and therefore contracts tuma as well. Now, what does this mean? This nan. So we'll say, now watch this. I'm standing over by the side of an oven, and there is a sheretz in that oven. So remember again about saying oven is a kli cheres, or an earthenware utensil. There's a sheretz inside of that kli cheres, which makes it tamei. Now remember again about saying their ovens, the opening was on the top. Okay, so now watch this. So now watch this. Now I extend my hand over the oven and somebody hands me water of para aduma. I take the water and I pass it back over the oven. So therefore, what happened over here? The waters of the para aduma passed over the opening of the oven. What's in the opening of an oven? Ultimately, again, the sheretz. So I passed it over an opening of tumah. What's the halacha? Rabbi Akiva metame, Rabbi Chum metamim. Ultimately, Rabbi Akiva says the waters are tamei, and the Chachamim say that it's tar. Now, what do you see from here? Ubaha pligi, Rabbi Akiva savar kimunach tami. Rabbi Akiva holds that when you pass the waters over the opening of the tanur, it's as if the waters have come to rest inside the tanur, and therefore are tamei. Rabbi Akiva Rabbanan savri lav kimunach tami. The Rabbanan say no, passing over the airspace of an area does not mean that, or does not treat it as if the item came to rest. Ubaha pligi, and what are they arguing about? Rabbi Akiva savar, it's good. Good. Ve'es ve'abai is the kasha. Mod Rabbi Akiva baza shavir agabe kli cheres tamei, or agabe mishkav umoshav tamei shehi tahora. But yet Sabai is the kasha. The Rabbi Akiva holds that if you do sprinkling, right, sprinkling of the waters, and the waters passed over a kli chares that is tamei, or something else, mishkav moshav, some other item, that's tamei, shehi tahora, that ultimately again is tar. So what do you see from here? The Rabbi Akiva holds that when something passes over airspace, it remains tar. What's going on over here? Why? She'in lecha davar shemen tamei l'mayla kilamata ele kizayis min hameis ushar kol ha'ma'ahilin. Because Rabbi Akiva holds that halacha l'maisa, there is no item that goes ahead and creates tuma in airspace. That's what it means. Metame l'mala kilamata. It is metame when it passes through the airspace, as if it came to rest, other than kizayis min hames, an actual, like literally again, kizayis from a corpse, or shar kol ha'ma'ahilin, or anything else that conveys tumas ohel. What does this come to include? Le'asuye even haminugas. Ultimately, again, a stone that itself has saras, which has the ability to convey tumas ohel. Ella, so therefore, Rabbi says, so what is the machlokes Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanon? El amar Abaye dukuli amalav kamunach tami. Rather, Abaye says like this: everyone agrees that when something passes over the airspace that contains something that is tamei, it is not as if the item came to rest by the area of tumah. So what's the machlokes over here? B'hacha miflagi. Rabbi Akiva savar gazrinan shema yanuach. Rabbi Akiva is concerned that the item may come to rest. V'Rabbanan Savri lo gazrinan. The Rabbanan say, no, we're not concerned. So Rabbi says, here this case, I'm standing by the tanur. The tanur has a sheretz on the inside. I extend my hand over the tanur. Somebody hands me waters of para aduma, and I pass the waters over the opening of the tanur. Rabbi Akiva says the waters are tameh. The Chachamim say the water is tar. So what's at the root of this machlokes? So originally we thought that the machlokes is something that comes in airspace as if it came to rest. Now the Gemara says, no, that's actually not the machlokes. The machlokes is we're concerned lest you come to put the item down. Rabbi Akiva is concerned that you may come to put the item down. The Chachamim are not concerned unless you come to put the item down. Mod Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva agrees in the case of Hazah. That was interesting. If Rabbi Akiva agrees, let's say, see, in the case they were talking about over here is, I actually holding the waters of the paraduma and I'm passing them over the opening of the oven. Rabbi Akiva says the waters are tameh because we are concerned you may come to put it down. The Rabbanan, we're not concerned you're going to put it down. What about a case where you sprinkle the waters, right? I'm the Kohen and I'm sprinkling the waters over the opening of the oven. What about in that case? Even Rabbi Akiva would agree that the waters are kosher. Why? Because there's no concern you may come to put the waters down. Why not? Kevan de nafak, nafak. Once you sprinkled, the waters left your hand. Once they left your hand, then what? There's no possibility that you're going to put them down to rest in the area that is tameh. Incredible. Rabbi Lazar v'Rabbanan kamakam. So I says ultimately again, what are Rabbi Lazar and the Rabbanan really arguing about? To which the Gemara says, "Am Rabbaye bidanin tuma keduma bituma shaba'osa shah kameflagi." They're arguing about to say, do we go ahead and learn out pre-existing tuma? Ultimately, again, from tuma that exists in that moment. If you take a look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi is in the third wide line. Bidanin tuma kiduma. Rashi says kigon mechatas shenitmu lefnei haza asan. Right. So do we learn out again? For example, paraduma waters that became tameh before their sprinkling. Mituma shaba'osa shah, from tuma that was created at that time. Kigon haza'as nida shetumas hamay v'hazah bain ke'echad. That would be the example of, let's say again, sprinkling paraduma waters on a nida, where the water becomes tameh at that exact moment. So ultimately, again, this is what they're arguing about. I'm sorry, I skipped. Mar Savar Danin and Mar Savar Ein Danin. Rav Amar says no. Duchuli Alma Ein Danin. Everyone agrees we do not learn it out. Here's the machlokes. Rabbi Elazar Savar Hazah Tzricha Shir Umitzarfen Lazos. Rabbi Elazar holds that ultimately, again, Hazah requires a shear, and the individual sprinklings actually combine to form the requisite shear. V'Rabbanan Savri Hazah Ein Tzricha Shir, and the Rabbanan ultimately again hold that no, there is no shear by Hazah. Okay, so we'll say so incredible. So first of all, just to point out over here, the question that we raised also again remains unanswered. That halacha l'maisa, if you went ahead and you sprinkled the water on a beget tameh, what is the status? Right? I'm sorry, not if you sprinkled. If sacrificial blood splattered on a beget tameh, ultimately, again, does the beged require kibus or not? So the Gemara seemingly leaves that question open. What the Gemara does address, Rabosai, which is actually quite interesting, is that halacha l'maisa apparently paraduma waters, even if it becomes tameh, still have the ability to affect tara, which is actually pretty amazing. And again, the raya for that is that you can sprinkle waters of paraduma on a nida, and she becomes tahora from tumas meis, even though, again, when those waters hit her, ultimately, again, the waters themselves will become tameya. Incredible. Chatas psula. So, says, remember again, the Mishnah then said that the only time that the din of kibos applies is when the blood is sacrificially fit. But for example, if the blood of an invalid chatos hits the garment, halacha l'maisa, again, there's no din of kibos. Tanabanan, where do we learn this from? Tanabanan, midama. Midam kshera v'lo midam psula. So the pasuk says from its blood, and from here we darshan only blood that is sacrificially fit, and not from blood that is sacrificially invalid. Rabbi Akiva says, Haisla shasa kosher v'nifsala, dama ta'un kibos. Lo haisla shasa kosher v'nifsala, ein damon taon kibus. So this is very interesting. So the Tanakama holds that in order for the din of kibus to apply, the blood that hits the garment itself has to be sacrificially fit. Rabbi Akiva holds that halacha l'maisa, as long as the blood was sacrificially fit at some point in time, even if it subsequently became Tameh, halacha l'maisa, it requires kibos. Rabbi Shimon says, echad zeh ve'echad zeh, ein damataon kibos. Rabbi Shimon says in both of these cases, ultimately again, it does not require kibos. Okay, the Gemara says, how so? How so? The Gemara says, my time with Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa. In both of these cases, there is no din of kibos. So my time with Rabbi Shimon. What's Rabbi Shimon's logic? So the Gemara says, ksiv osa uksiv midama. It says osa, and it says from its blood. Chad lehecha dahais lo shasa kosher. Right? Rabbi Akiva. I'm sorry. Chad. Sorry. Let's read that again. Ksiv osa. Ksiv osa uksiv midama. Chad lehecha dahaisa lo shasa kosher. One is coming to tell us about a case where the blood was sacrificially fit at one point in time. Rabbi Akiva will say osa prat truma, that comes to exclude truma. Rabbi Shmuel Silber damar kachim kalim ein tu'unin marika ushtifa v'kol shekein truma. And ultimately, Rabbi Shimon goes according to his logic. So Rabbi Shimon says in general, kachim kalim are not subject to the laws of marika and shtifa, which is again, I will say, the laws of kashering, right after the utensils used for sacrificial use, and all the more so that would apply to truma as well. Incredible. So I'll say halacha l'maisa. The way that Rambam paskins is the only time that there will be a din of kibus is when the blood that splatters on the garment ultimately is sacrificially fit. But if the blood is unfit, whether it was never fit or whether halacha l'maisa again it was fit and then became unfit, ultimately again there's only a din of kibus if the blood that splatters on the garment itself is sacrificially fit for use. Incredible. Okay, Mishnah. Nitaz minat savra ala baged eno ta'on kibus. We'll see another interesting case. Now remember, the Mishnah now is dealing with a different case. Let's say the Kohen shechted the animal and the blood from the neck of the animal splattered on the Kohen's clothing. So the Mishnah says, in that case, there's no din of kibus. There's no din of kibus. Which I will say, the truth is, even before we get into this, it makes sense. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, what type of blood requires kibus? What type of blood? Sacrificially fit blood. When does blood become sacrificially fit? Ultimately, again, when there's Kabbalah, right? It goes from the neck into the kli. So therefore, if the blood splatters from the neck onto the garment of the Kohen, there is no din of kibos. Mina keren umina yisod. Similarly, again, if let's say the Kohen is doing the blood applications and it splashes back from the corner of the mizbeach onto his garment, or from the yisod, from the base, it splashes back, enoton kibos. There is no din of kibos. Nishpach ala ritzpa va'asvo. Let's say again the sacrificial blood spilled on the floor. The Kohen collected it. Ein taon kibos. Ultimately, again, there is no din kibos. There's no din kibos on that blood as well. Why? Because the Mishnah says, Ein taon kibos eladamshin is kabel bekli barai lahazah. Because what I will say, here's the rule. What type of blood requires kibos? Only blood that was received in a kli, that was received in a utensil, and ultimately again is fit for sprinkling. Says the Gemara Tan Rabbanon, Yochol nitaz minat sava ala baged yehei taon kibos. You might have thought that when the blood splatters from the neck onto the garment, ultimately again it would require kibos. Talmud Lomar asher yazeh. Therefore, the pasuk says that will be sprinkled. La'marti lecha ela barai lazah. It is only blood that is fit for sprinkling that ultimately, again, generates a kibos obligation. Tanya idach, another brayso. Tanya idach yachal mitaz mina keren mini yesod yeton kibos. I might have thought that if the blood splattered back from the corner or from the base, you should require kibos. Talmud Lomar asher yazeh. Therefore, the pasuk says that will sprinkle. Prat lezeh shekvar chuzah. Ultimately, again, this excludes blood that was already sprinkled. They will say, see, hear this? In other words, if the blood was already sprinkled on the mizbeach, and then ultimately, again, splashes back, then halacha l'maisa, that blood was already sprinkled, and therefore not taon kibos. So therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, we're really defining this. The only type of blood that requires kibos ultimately again is blood that is fit for sprinkling. What is that? That's blood that has been received in a utensil and ultimately, again, is ready to be used. But if the blood was already used, or for that matter, again, the blood spurted from the neck of the animal onto the clothing, ultimately no din of kibos. Nishpach ala ritzbah, if it's spilled on the floor, we'll say on the base, hasulamali. Why do I need that last case? We'll say that last case is a little bit obvious. Why do I need to be told that if the blood spilled on the floor and then it got onto the garment of the Kohen, that there's no din of kibos? To which the Gemara says, Matam kamar. So the Gemara is really giving you the reason. Matam nishpach ala ritzbah va'asva intaun kibos. Why is it that if sacrificial blood poured on the floor and then you regathered it and it went ahead and splattered on the garment, that there's no din of kibos? Why is that? Because also the only time that there is a din of kibos, ultimately again, is a time where the blood was collected in a kli and fit for sprinkling. So we'll say, so that's our rule. So therefore, essentially, the Mishnah was just illustrating the rule with this case of the blood that fell on the floor. Okay, Rai Laza, suppose say, so remember again, so bottom line, the only time that there is a laundering, a kibos obligation, is when the blood itself is fit for sprinkling. Therefore, the paradigmatic case would be, you receive the blood in the utensil, so now the blood is ready to be sprinkled, has not yet been sprinkled, and gets on the garment, requires kibos. But if the blood was never collected in a kli, or the blood was already used for sprinkling, and then it got on the garment, no din of kibos. So Gemara says, now when we say that the blood has to be fit for sprinkling, what does this come to exclude? So Gemara says, it comes to exclude the following case, where let's say, you collect blood in 2 utensils, but in each utensil there's not enough blood for the sprinkling. So the Gemara says, Tisanya, Rabbi Chalafta bar Shal Omer, Kidesh pachos zia bekliza. If you collect not enough blood, in other words, too little blood for sprinkling in one kli, upachos mikdei zia bekliza, and less than the necessary amount for sprinkling in a different kli, lo kidesh. The kli itself does not sanctify the blood. The only time that sacrificial blood becomes sanctified in a kli shares is if there's enough blood for sprinkling purposes. But if there's not enough blood in the kli, then the kli does not sanctify. And again, if the kli does not sanctify, then what? Then when that blood gets on the garment does not require kibos. Say bailahu, bedam mahu. Bidam, so the Gemara says, Bidam mau. So the Gemara says, now, so here's the shayla. So when it comes with dam, so Bidam mau. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Mau hilchasahi, or hilchasalo gamrinon, o dilma hasam maitzabosai. So again, so now the Gemara asks as follows. So do we say that it's just a halacha? Look at Rashi says. Rashi says, Bidam mai, kabechatas hapenimis kiba pachos mikdeazia, v'chazar ve'irev mi havi kabala olos. So we'll say, so here's the shayla. The shayla is like this. If you went ahead and you received too little blood in the kli, and then you received more blood, ultimately, again, does that work? So do we say hilchas sahi, or hilchas alo gaminon? So do we say that ultimately, again, do we say that halacha lamaisa again? We'll say, by the way, I'm sorry, I just realized before, the case of kidesh pachos michtei aziyah by paraduma waters. Right now, the Gemara is asking the same shay. I'm sorry. So the first case was by waters of paraduma. If you receive too little water, not enough water for sprinkling purposes, right, in one kli, right, if you receive too little waters in a kli, then the kli does not sanctify the water. Okay, now the Gemara is asking the same shayla by sacrificial blood. If you received too little blood in the kli, not enough for sprinkling, what does the kli sanctify the blood? So b'dam mahu hilchas. So do we say that it's just a halacha? Ultimately, again by paraduma, or mehilchas alogamina. You can't learn out one halacha from another halacha. O dilma hasamai taima, or we say no by paraduma. What's the reason why if you receive not enough water for sprinkling purposes in a kli, that the kli doesn't sanctify the water? The Gemara says dichsiv v'taval b'mayim, because the pasuk says you will go ahead and literally again immerse. This is the hyssop, right? You'll immerse the hyssop, the eis erez eizov. You'll into the water. So to by sacrificial blood, he uses the same lashon of a taval, of immersing. So we'll say, so that's the shayla. So again, interestingly enough, we know that by para aduma, if you don't have enough water in the utensil for for sprinkling purposes, the water itself is not consecrated. We're asking, does the same halacha apply by blood or not? So Tashma, let's analyze. Af bedam lo kidesh. If you do not have enough blood for sprinkling purposes in the kli, then ultimately, again, the kli does not consecrate the blood. Amar Rava, Tanya, as well as interestingly enough, according to this approach, we are equating ultimately again blood with the waters of the paraduma. Amar Rava Tanya, v'taval. So the pasuk says you shall immerse. V'lo mesapeg, right? Mesapeg, v'lo mesapeg bedam ad she bedam shir tvila. So as I said, halacha is you have to immerse, and v'lo mesapeg means you don't wipe. You don't wipe. Rashi says, "Mekaneach b'shuli hakli o b'dof nosav." So this is very interesting. When you go ahead and you have to get the blood for the sprinkling purposes, you have to immerse your finger inside of the kli and not gather up the blood by going ahead and scraping your finger along the walls of the kli. There has to be enough blood gathered in the kli itself that you could simply immerse your finger and get the requisite amount. Badam, Achi badam shir tevila me'ikaro. Ultimately, again, until there isn't, and there must be enough blood in the kli from the beginning. Min adam, ultimately, again, min adam shebe'inyan. Ultimately, again, Allah Chamaisa from the blood. Min adam shebe'inyan, Rashi says over shebe'inyan. Midam ha'amar be'inyan tvila shehizim imena rishona, yazes kula, shetarech lachser v'litbal bo etzbo, al kolazia tvila l'meuti shem shebe etzba. So this is actually very interesting. This also teaches us that when you have a requirement of multiple blood applications, ultimately, again, you can't use the leftover from one application for the next. So let's say, again, the Kohen dips his finger, does the sprinkling. When he does the second sprinkling, ultimately, again, he has to re-immerse his finger and can't use any residual blood. And I both say it has to say badam. Why? Because of Rahman v'taval. If it would have just said v'taval, hava amina afapi deleka shir tvila meikaro. I would have said that it's fine, the blood is kosher, even though there's not enough blood in the kli from the beginning. Because of Rahman badam. Therefore, the pasuk says badam, because of Rahman badam. And if it would have just said badam havamina filim esapeg, I would have thought that you could even smear your finger against the wall of the kli to accumulate the necessary amount of blood. Therefore, because of Rahmana v'taval, umin adam shebe'inyan lemi'ute mai. So we'll say, what does that come to exclude? Amarava lemi'uti shirayim shebe'etzba. That comes to exclude the use of any leftover blood on one's finger for a second application. So we'll say, we'll stop over here for today, but just understand what we just stopped with. We established it like this. By para aduma, in order for the kli to consecrate the waters, there has to be enough water for the sprinkling in the kli all at once. The shaila is that the same halacha by blood? It appears to be the answer to that is yes. That in order for blood to be consecrated by a kli shares, you have to have enough blood for the requisite sprinklings in the kli all together at once. In addition to that, there's some other halachas, which is when the Kohen dips his finger in the blood, there has to be enough pooled blood that he can dip it in, get what he needs. If he needs to smear his finger against the sides in order to accumulate blood, that's going to be invalid. Not only that, when you have to do multiple sprinklings, so again, you dip your finger and do the sprinkling, any residual blood on your finger cannot be used for the second sprinkling. The second sprinkling must come from new blood within the kli. Okay, we'll pick up in with more details about that tomorrow. We'll say shkoyach. Actually, I think this is, no, was it turned back on? Okay.